I would imagine most people are familiar with Conan, who was written by Robert E. Howard. Robert E. Howard wrote a lot of stories. And tonight we'll be presenting Solomon Kane. Now, the character of Solomon Kane, as they say, is one of Robert E. Howard's sword and sorcery creations. Unlike Conan and Kull, Solomon Kane is neither barbarian nor king. Instead, he's a Puritan adventurer traveling through Europe and Africa during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Armed with his sword and pistols, he battles wickedness in the name of God wherever he encounters it. Sometimes this means Solomon fights common brigands and pirates. Other times it means he pits his wits and brawn against black sorcery. Whenever possible, Kane deals out death to those he considers evil. In terms of psychology, Kane believes he's doing God's work. Kane always strives to do good as he sees fit. Now, the wonderful twist to this avenging angel of goodness is that Robert Howard makes it abundantly clear that Solomon Kane is a, fully functional madman. Of Howard's most enduring creations, Solomon Kane is probably the most fully developed character, perhaps also offers the deepest glimpse into the tortured soul of Robert E. Howard. Yes, we really will start stories in just a moment. I just want to give you some background on Solomon Kane because not everybody's familiar with him. It's a reasonable supposition to believe that Robert E. Howard originally named this character Solomon Kane so that his name reflects both aspects of his personality. Solomon standing for the biblical judge, and Cain for the first assassin in the history of humanity. The result being a man endlessly looking for justice and using his extremely violent inner self to punish evil wherever he encounters it. And as Hero points out, there is a movie. I thought it was quite good. There was supposed to be, when they made the first movie, they were supposed to make a trilogy, but they've never actually gotten around to the second one so far. And the name of the actor in it evades me, but he's marvelous. Famous for his quest to rid the world of evil in all its forms, Solomon Kane vanquishes evil not only to protect the world, but to atone for his own past misdeeds. He is a stern, pale man in his 40s. Being a 16th century Puritan, he looks upon all magic as being of devious origin and a phenomenon he has to fight by all means. His fight also allows him to quench his inner rage and unleash his berserker-like temper onto beings he shall feel no regrets for exterminating. The uncontrollable rage often allows him to defeat enemies supposedly much stronger than he is, and even on one occasion to grasp upon a creature from the ethereal realm and shred it to pieces. Solomon Kane possesses no superpowers unto himself, but he is a grand master swordsman and has strength and stamina far above that of the common man. Solomon Kane's fanaticism makes him impervious to temptation, sometimes triggers his legendary rage. When in a state of rage, Solomon seems to be capable of relentlessly pounding and slicing on natural and supernatural creatures with an extreme efficiency, feeling virtually no pain until the fight is over. So if you're interested in reading more about the adventures of Solomon Kane, the book we're reading from tonight is The Savage Tales of Solomon Kane by Robert E. Howard. I'd like to start us off first with a bit of poetry of Robert Howard's. And this is about a real-life person, Sir Thomas Doughty, who was executed at Julian's Bay in 1578. Thomas Doughty was an English nobleman and a soldier. His association with Francis Drake on a 1577 voyage to interfere with Spanish treasure fleets ended in a shipboard trial for treason and witchcraft and Doughty's execution. Our Solomon Kane was there, and Solomon spoke out to Sir Francis Drake, objecting to his execution of Sir Thomas Doughty. They carried him on the barren sand, where the rebel captains died, where the grim grey rotting gibbets stand, as Magellan reared them on the strand, and the gulls that haunt the lonesome land wailed to the lonely tide. Drake faced them all like a lion at bay, with his lion head upflung. Dare ye my words of law defy, to say this traitor shall not die? And his captains dared not meet his eye, but each man held his tongue. Solomon Kane stood forth alone, grim man of sober face. Worthy of death he may well be, but the trial ye held was a mockery. Ye hid your spite at a travesty where justice hid your face. More the man had ye been on deck your sword to cleanly draw and forthright fury from its sheath and openly cleave him to the teeth, rather than slink and hide beneath a hollow word of law. Hell rose in the eyes of Francis Drake. "Puritan knave," swore he, "headsman, give him the axe instead. He shall strike off yon traitor's head." Solomon folded his arms and said, darkly and somberly, "I am no slave for your butcher's work." "Bind him with triple strands," Drake roared, and the men obeyed, hesitantly as if afraid. But Kane moved not as they took his blade and pinioned his iron hands. They bent the doomed man over to his knees, the man who was to die. They saw his lips in a strange smile bend. One last long look they saw him send at Drake, his judge and his one-time friend, who dared not meet his eye. The axe flashed silver in the sun, a red arc slashed the sand. A voice cried out as the head fell clear, and the watchers flinched in sudden fear, though 'twas but a seabird whirling near above the lonely strand. "This be every traitor's end," Drake cried, and yet again. Slowly his captains turned and went, and their admiral's stare was elsewhere bent than where the cold scorn with anger blent in the eyes of Solomon Kane. Night fell on the crawling waves. The admiral's door was closed. Solomon lay in the stenching hold, his irons clashed as the ship rolled, and his guard, grown weary and overbold, laid down his pipe and dozed. He woke with a hand at his corded throat that gripped him like a vice. Trembling, he yielded up the key, and the somber Puritan stood free, his cold eyes gleaming murderously with the wrath that is slow to rise. Unseen to the admiral's door went Solomon Kane from the guard, through the night and silence of that ship, the guard's keen dagger in his grip. No man of the dull crew saw him slip through the door unbarred. Drake at the table sat alone, his face sunk in his hands. He looked up as if from sleeping, but his eyes were blank with weeping, as if he saw not creeping death's swiftly flowing sands. He reached no hand for gun or blade to halt the hand of Kane, nor even seemed to hear or see, lost in the black mists of memory. Love turned to hate and treachery and bitter cankering pain. A moment Solomon Kane stood there, the dagger poised before, as a condor stoops above a bird, and Francis Drake spoke not nor stirred. And Kane went forth without a word and closed the cabin door. It's a poem called The Black Stain by Robert E. Howard. So on to stories, shall we? The first one is Skulls in the Stars. Now, Kane, in this one, is on his way to the hamlet of Torkertown and must choose one of two paths, a route that leads through a moor or one that leads through a swamp. He's warned that the moor route is haunted and all travelers who take that road die. And so, of course, he decides to take that road and investigate. He told how murderers walk the earth beneath the curse of Cain, with crimson clouds before their eyes and flames about their brain. For blood has left upon their souls its everlasting stain. Yichard, you're in voice good, excellent. Now, my friends, there are two roads to Torkertown. One, the shorter and the more direct route, leads across a barren upland moor, and the other, which is much longer, winds its tortuous way in and out among the hummocks and quagmires of the swamps, skirting the low hills to the east. It was a dangerous and tedious trail, to be sure, and so Solomon Kane halted in amazement when a breathless youth from the village he had just left overtook him and implored him for God's sake to take the swamp road. The swamp road? Kane stared at the boy. He was a tall, gaunt man, was Solomon Kane, his darkly pallid face and deep-brooding eyes made more somber by the drab, puritanical garb he affected. "Yes, sir, 'tis far safer," the youngster answered to his surprised exclamation. Then the moor road must be haunted by Satan himself, for your townsman warned me against traversing the other.
Because of the quagmires, sir, that you might not see in the dark. You had better return to the village and continue your journey in the morning, sir.
Taking the swamp road, hmm?
Yes, sir.
Kane shrugged his shoulders and shook his head. The moon rises almost as soon as twilight dies. By its light I can reach Torker Town in a few hours across the moor.
Sir, you had better not. No one ever goes that way. There are no houses at all upon the moor, while in the swamp there is the house of old Ezra. Old Ezra, who lives there alone since his maniac cousin Gideon wandered off and died in the swamp and was never found. And old Ezra, though a miser, would not refuse you lodging should you decide to stop until morning. But since you must go, you had better go the swamp road, sir.
Kane eyed the boy piercingly. The lad squirmed and shuffled his feet. Since this moor road is so dour to wayfarers, said the Puritan, why did not the villagers tell me the whole tale instead of vague mouthings?
Aye, men like not to talk of it, sir. We hoped that you would take the swamp road after the men advised you to, but when we watched and saw that you turned not at the folks, they sent me to run after you and beg you to reconsider.
Name of the devil! Exclaimed Kane sharply, the unaccustomed oath showing his irritation. The swamp road and the moor road. What is it that threatens me, and why should I go miles out of my way and risk the bogs and mires, boy?
Sir,
said the boy, dropping his voice and drawing closer.
We be simple villagers here, sir, who like not to talk of such things lest foul fortune befall us. But the moor road is a way accursed, and hath not been traversed by any of the countryside for a year or more. It is death to walk those moors by night, as hath been found by some score of unfortunates. Some foul horror haunts the way, and claims men for his victims.
So? And what is this thing like?
Ah, no man knows, sir. None has ever seen it and lived. But late farers have heard terrible laughter far out on the fen, and men have heard the horrid shrieks of its victims. Sir, in God's name, return to the village, sir. There pass the night, and tomorrow take the swamp trail to Torker Town, and more power to ye.
Far back in Kane's gloomy eyes, the scintillant light had begun to glimmer, like a witch's torch glinting under fathoms of cold gray ice. His blood quickened. Adventure, the lure of life, risk, and drama. Not that Kane recognized his own sensations as such, no. He sincerely considered that he voiced his real feelings when he said, These things must be deeds of some power of evil. The lords of darkness have laid a curse upon the country. A strong man is needed to combat Satan and his might, and therefore I go, I who have defied him many times.
But, sir,
the boy began, and closed his mouth as he saw the futility of argument. He only added,
The corpses of the victims are bruised and torn, sir.
He stood there at the crossroads, sighing regretfully as he watched the tall, rangy figure swinging up the road that led toward the moors. The sun was setting as Kane came over the brow of the low hill which debouched into the upland fen. Huge and blood-red the sun sank down behind the sullen horizon of the moors, seeming to touch the rank grass with a fire. So for a moment the watcher seemed to be gazing out across a sea of blood. Then the dark shadows came gliding from the east. The western blaze faded, and Solomon Kane struck out boldly in the gathering darkness. The road was dim from disuse, but was clearly defined. Kane went swiftly, but warily, sword and pistols at hand. Stars blinked out, and the night winds whispered among the grass like weeping specters. The moon began to rise, lean and haggard, like a skull among the stars. Then suddenly Kane stopped short. From somewhere in front of him sounded a strange and eerie echo, or something like an echo. Again, this time louder. Kane started forward again. Were his senses deceiving him? No. Far out there pealed a whisper of frightful laughter, and again, closer this time. No human being ever laughed like that. There was no mirth in it, only hatred and horror and soul-destroying terror. Kane halted. He was not afraid, but for the second he was almost unnerved. And then stabbing through that awesome laughter came the sound of a scream that was undoubtedly human. Kane started forward, increasing his gait. He cursed the elusive lights and the flickering shadows which veiled the moor and the rising moon and made accurate sight impossible. The maniac laughter continued, growing louder, as did the screams, and then sounded faintly the drum of frantic human feet. Kane broke into a run. Some human was being hunted to death out there on the fen, and by what manner of horror God alone knew. The sound of the flying feet halted abruptly, and the screaming rose unbearably, mingled with other sounds and unnameable and hideous. Evidently the man had been overtaken, and Kane, his flesh crawling, visualized some ghastly fiend of the darkness crouching on the back of its victim, crouching and tearing. And then the noise of a terrible and short struggle came clearly through the abysmal silence of the night, and the footfalls began again, but stumbling and uneven. The screaming continued, but with a gasping gurgle now. The sweat stood cold on Kane's forehead and body. This was a heaping horror on horror in an intolerable manner. God, for a moment's clear light! The frightful drama was being enacted within a very short distance of him, to judge by the ease with which the sounds reached him. But this hellish half-light veiled all in shifting shadows, so that the moors appeared a haze of blurred illusions, and stunted trees and bushes seemed like giants. Kane shouted, striving to increase the speed of his advance. The shrieks of the unknown broke into a hideous, shrill squealing. Again there was the sound of a struggle, and then from the shadows of the tall grass a thing came reeling, a thing that had once been a man, a gore-covered, frightful thing that fell at Kane's feet and writhed and groveled and raised its terrible face to the rising moon and gibbered and yammered and fell down again and died in its own blood. The moon was up now. The light was better. Kane bent above the body, which lay stark in its unnameable mutilation, and he shuddered, a rare thing for Solomon Kane, who had seen the deeds of the Spanish Inquisition and the witch-finders. Some wayfarer, he supposed. And then, like a hand of ice on his spine, Kane was aware that he was not alone. He looked up, his cold eyes piercing the shadows whence the dead man had staggered. He saw nothing, but he knew, he felt, that other eyes gave back his stare, terrible eyes not of this earth. He straightened and he drew a pistol, waiting. The moonlight spread like a lake of pale blood over the moor, and trees and grasses took on their proper sizes. The shadows melted, and Kane saw. At first, he thought it was only a shadow of mist, a wisp of moor fog that swayed in the tall grass before him. He gazed. More illusion, he thought. But then the thing began to take on shape, vague and indistinct. Two hideous eyes flamed at him, eyes which held all the stark horror which has been the heritage of man since the fearful dawn ages. Eyes, frightful and insane, with an insanity transcending earthly insanity. The form of this thing was misty and vague, a brain-shattering travesty on the human form, like, yet horribly unlike. The grasses and bushes beyond showed clearly through it. Kane felt the blood pound in his temples, yet he was cold as ice. How such an unstable being as that which wavered before him could harm a man in a physical way was more than Kane could understand, and yet the red horror at his feet gave mute testimony that the fiend could act with terrible and material effect. Of one thing Kane was sure. There would be no hunting of him across the dreary moors. No screaming and fleeing to be dragged down again and again. If he must die, he would die in his tracks, his wounds in front. Now a vague and grisly mouth gaped wide, and the demonic laughter again shrieked, but soul-shaking its nearness, and in the midst of that threat of doom, Kane deliberately leveled his long pistol and fired. A maniacal yell of rage and mockery answered the report, and the thing came at him like a flying sheet of smoke. Long, shadowy arms stretched to drag him down. Kane, moving with the dynamic speed of a famished wolf, fired the second pistol with as little effect, snatched his long rapier from its sheath and thrust it into the center of the misty attacker. The blade sang as it passed clear through, encountering no solid resistance, and Kane felt icy fingers grip his limbs, bestial talons tear his garments and the skin beneath. Kane dropped the useless sword and sought to grapple with his foe. It was like fighting a floating mist, a flying shadow armed with dagger-like claws. His savage blows met empty air, his leanly mighty arms, in whose grasp strong men had died. Those arms swept nothingness and clutched emptiness. Naught now was solid or real, save the flaying ape-like fingers with their crooked talons and the crazy eyes which burned into the shuddering depths of Kane's soul. Kane realized that he was in a desperate plight indeed. Already his garments hung in tatters, and he bled from a score of deep wounds. But he never flinched, and the thought of flight never entered Kane's mind. He had never fled from a single foe, and had the thought occurred to him, he would have flushed with shame. He saw no help for it now, but that his form should lie there beside the fragments of the other victim. But the thought held no terrors for Kane. His only wish was to give as good an account of himself as possible before the end came, and if he could, to inflict some damage on his earthly foe. And there, above the dead man's torn body, man fought with demon under the pale light of the rising moon, with all the advantages with the demon, save one. And that one advantage was enough to overcome the others. For if abstract hate may bring into material substance a ghostly thing, may not courage, equally abstract, form a concrete weapon to combat that ghost? Kane fought with his arms, and his feet, and his hands, and he was aware at last that the ghost began to give back before him. To give back. And the fearful laughter changed to screams of baffled fury. For man's only weapon is courage, that flinches not from the gates of hell itself. And against such not even the legions of hell can stand. Of this Kane knew nothing. Kane only knew that the talons which tore and rended him seemed to grow weaker and wavering, that a wild light grew and grew in those horrible eyes. And the reeling and gasping he rushed in, grappled the thing at last and threw it. And as they tumbled about on the moor, it writhed and it lapped his limbs like a serpent of smoke. Kane's flesh crawled, his hair stood on end, for he began to understand the thing's gibbering. He did not hear and comprehend as you and I, mortals, hear and comprehend the speech of man, but the frightful secrets it imparted in its whisperings and yammerings and screaming silences sank fingers of ice into Kane's soul. And he knew. He knew. The hut of old Ezra the miser stood by the road in the midst of the swamp, half screened by the sullen trees which grew about it. The walls were rotting, the roof crumbling. The great pallid and green fungus monsters clung to it and writhed about the doors and windows as if seeking to peer within. He likes that word, writhed, doesn't he? The trees leaned above it, and their gray branches intertwined so that it crouched in semi-darkness like a monstrous dwarf over those whose shoulder ogres leer. The road which wound down into the swamp among rotting stumps and rank hummocks and scummy snake-haunted pools and bogs crawled past the hut. Many people passed that way these days, but few saw old Ezra, save a glimpse of a yellow face peering through the fungus-screened windows itself, that face itself like an ugly fungus. Old Ezra, the miser, partook of the quality of the swamp, for he was gnarled and bent and sullen. His fingers were like clutching parasitic plants, and his locks hung like drab moss above eyes trained to the murk of the swamplands. His eyes were like a dead man's eyes, yet hinted of depths abysmal and loathsome as the dead lakes of the swamplands. These eyes of old Ezra gleamed now at the man who stood in front of his hut. This man was tall and gaunt and dark. His face was haggard and claw-marked, and he was bandaged of arm and leg. Something behind this man stood a number of villagers. "You are Ezra of the swamp road." "Aye, I am, and what do you want of me?" "Where is your cousin Gideon, the maniac youth who abode with you?" "Ah, Gideon?" "Aye, your cousin Gideon. Where is he?"
"Ah, Gideon wandered away into the swamp and never came back. No doubt he lost his way, was set upon by wolves, or died in a quagmire, or was struck by an adder.
How long ago?
Over a year, stranger.
Aye. Hark ye, Ezra the miser. Soon after your cousin's disappearance, a countryman, coming home across the moors, was set upon by some unknown fiend and torn to pieces, was he not? And thereafter became death across those moors. First men of the countryside, then strangers who wandered over the fen, fell to the clutches of the thing. Many men have died since the first one. Last night, I, Solomon Kane, crossed those moors, and heard the flight and pursuing of another victim, a stranger who knew not the evils of the moors. Ezra the miser, it was a fearful thing, for the wretch twice broke from the fiend, terribly wounded. Each time the demon caught and dragged him down again, and Dagmar worried if she'd get nightmares over it. And at last he fell dead at my very feet, done to death in a manner that would freeze the statue of a giant, Ezra the miser. The villagers moved restlessly and murmured fearfully to each other, and old Ezra's eyes shifted furtively. Yet the somber expression of Solomon Kane never altered, and his condor-like stare seemed to transfix the miser.
Aye,
Muttered old Ezra hurriedly.
a bad thing, a bad thing, not a good place to take a casual walk at night. Yet why do you tell this thing to me?
Aye, it is a sad thing. Hearken further, Ezra. The fiend came out of the shadows. I fought with it over the body of its victim. Aye, how I overcame I know not, for the battle was hard and long, but the powers of good and light were on my side, which are mightier than the powers of hell. And at last, I, Solomon Kane, was the stronger, and that thing broke from me and fled, and I followed to no avail. Yet, before it fled, it whispered to me a monstrous truth. Old Ezra started, stared wildly, seemed to shrink into himself.
Why tell me this, then?
I returned to the village and I told my tale, said Kane, for I knew that now I had the power to rid the moors of its curse forever, Ezra. Ezra, come with us.
Where?
To the rotting oak on the moors. Ezra reeled as though struck. Ezra screamed incoherently, and he turned to flee. On the instant, at Kane's sharp order, two brawny villagers sprang forward and seized the miser. They twisted the dagger from his withered hand, pinioned his arms, shuddering as their fingers encountered his clammy flesh. Kane motioned them to follow, and turning strode up the trail, followed by the villagers, who found their strength taxed to the utmost in their task of bearing their prisoner along. Through the swamp they went and out, taking a little-used trail which led up over the low hills and out onto the moor. The sun was gliding down the horizon, and old Ezra stared at it with bulging eyes, stared as if he could not gaze enough. And far out on the moors reared up the great oak tree, like a gibbet, now only a decaying shell. And here, Solomon Kane halted. Old Ezra writhed in his captor's grasp and made inarticulate noises. Over a year ago, said Solomon Kane, you, Ezra, fearing that your insane cousin Gideon would tell men of your cruelties to him, you brought him away from the swamp by the very trail by which we came, and you, Ezra, murdered him here in the night. Ezra cringed and snarled.
You cannot prove that lie.
Kane spoke a few words to the agile villager. The agile youth clambered up the rotting bole of the tree, and from a crevice high up dragged something that fell with a clatter at the feet of the miser. Ezra went limp with a terrible shriek. The object that fell at his feet was a man's skeleton, the skull cleft.
You! How knew you of this? You are Satan!
Gibbered old Ezra. Kane folded his arms. No, I'm not. The thing I fought last night told me this thing as we reeled in battle, and I followed it to this tree. For the fiend is Gideon's ghost. Ezra shrieked again and fought savagely. You knew, said Kane somberly. You knew what things did these deeds. You feared the ghost of the maniac. That is why you chose to leave his body on the fen instead of concealing it in the swamp, for you knew the ghost would haunt the place of its death. He was insane in life, and in death he did not know where to find his slayer, else he had come to you in your hut if he did. He hates no man but you, Ezra. But his mazed spirit cannot tell one man from the other, and he slays all, lest he let his killer escape. Yet, Ezra, he will know you, and rest in peace forever after. Hate hath made of his ghost a solid thing that can rend and slay. Though he feared you terribly in life, in death he fears you not at all, Ezra. Kane halted. He glanced at the sun. All this I had from Gideon's ghost, in his yammerings and his whisperings and his shrieking silences. Naught but your death will lay that ghost. Ezra listened in breathless silence, and Kane pronounced the words of his doom. A hard thing it is, said Kane somberly, to sentence a man to death in cold blood, and in such manner as I have in mind, but you must die that others may live, and God knoweth you deserve death. You shall not die by noose, bullet, or sword, but at the talons of him you slew, for naught else will satiate him. At these words Ezra's brain fair shattered. His knees gave way, and he fell groveling and screaming for death, begging them to burn him at the stake, to flay him alive. Kane's face was set like death, and the villagers, the fear rousing their cruelty, bound the screeching wretch to the oak tree, and one of them bade him make his peace with God. But Ezra made no answer. Shrieking in a high, shrill voice with unbearable monotony, that the villager would have struck the miser across the face, but Kane stayed him. Let him make his peace with Satan, whom he is more like to meet, said the Puritan grimly. The sun is about to set. Loose his cords so that he may work loose by dark, since it is better to meet death free than unshackled and bound like a sacrifice. As they turned to leave him, old Ezra yammered and gibbered unhuman sounds, and then fell silent, staring at the sun with a terrible intensity. They walked away across the fen, and Kane flung a last look at the grotesque form bound to the tree, seeming in the uncertain light like a great fungus growing to the bole. And suddenly the miser screamed hideously, "Death! Death! There are skulls! There are skulls in the stars!" Life was good to him, though he was gnarled and churlish and evil. Kane sighed. Mayhap God has a place for such souls where fire and sacrifice may cleanse them of the dross as fire cleans the forest or fungus things. Yet my heart is heavy within me. Nay, sir, one of the villagers spoke. Ye have done but the will of God, and good alone shall come of this night's deed. Nay, answered Kane heavily, I know not. The sun had gone down, and night spread with amazing swiftness, as if the great shadows came rushing down from unknown voids to cloak the world with hurrying darkness. Through the thick night came a weird echo, and the men halted and looked back the way they had come. Nothing could be seen. The moor now was an ocean of shadows, and the tall grass about them bent in long waves before the faint wind, breaking the deathly stillness with breathless murmurings. Then far away, the red disk of the moon rose over the fen, and for an instant, a grim silhouette was etched blackly against that moon. A shape came flying across the face of the moon, a bent, grotesque thing whose feet seemed scarcely to touch the earth, and close behind came a thing like a flying shadow, a nameless, shapeless horror. A moment, the racing twain stood out boldly against that moon, and they merged into one unnameable, formless mass, and vanished in the shadows. And far across the fen sounded a single shriek, terrible laughter, such as Dagmar has spelled out for us. So that's Skulls in the Stars. And we got one more story for you. I think we can squeeze in. Rattle of Bones. Yes, Robert Howard, amazing man, produced well over 100 stories, and sadly took his own life at 25. What, what genius snuffed out how early? Rattle of Bones. In this, Kane meets a traveler named Gaston Le Marne, who seems familiar to Kane, and together they take rooms in the Cleft Skull Tavern. Landlord, ho! The shout broke the lowering silence and reverberated through the black forest with sinister echoing. This place hath a forbidding aspect, meseemeth. Two men stood in front of the forest tavern. The building was low, long and rambling, built of heavy logs. Its small windows were heavily barred, and the door was closed. Above the door, its sinister sign showed faintly. A cleft skull. A good name for a tavern, methinks. Me too, Astoria. No, wait, I can still hear myself. Everybody else can hear me, or are we gone? Then I stopped talking so you wouldn't know. Hopefully you can still hear me. Let me know if you can't. Okay, good. The door to the tavern swung slowly open and a bearded face peered out. The owner of the face stepped back and motioned his guest to enter. With a grudging gesture, it seemed. A candle gleamed on a table, a flame smoldered in the fireplace. Your name's meh? Solomon Kane, said the tall man briefly.
Gaston Le Marne,
The other spoke curtly.
but what is that to you?
Strangers are few in the Black Forest. Bandits many. Sit at yonder table, I'll bring you food.
The two men sat down with the bearing of men who have traveled far. One was a tall, gaunt man, clad in a featherless hat and somber black garments which set off the dark pallor of his forbidding face. The other was of a different type entirely, bedecked with lace and plumes, although his finery was somewhat stained from travel. This man was handsome in a bold way. His restless eyes shifted from side to side, never still an instant. The host brought wine and food to the rough-hewn table, then stood back in the shadows, like a somber image. The host brought wine and food to the rough-hewn table, then stood back in the shadows. Like a somber image, his features now receding into vagueness, now luridly etched in the firelight as it leaped and flickered, were masked in a beard which seemed almost animal-like in thickness. The great nose curved above this beard, and two small red eyes stared unblinkingly at his guests. "Who are you?" asked the younger man suddenly.
I am the host of the Cleft Skull Tavern,
Sullenly replied the other. His tone seemed to challenge his questioner to ask further.
Do you have many guests?
Le Marne pursued.
Few come here twice,
The host grunted. Kane started and glanced up straight into those small red eyes as if he sought for some hidden meaning in the host's words. The flaming eyes seemed to dilate, then drop sullenly before the Englishman's cold stare. "I'm for bed," said Kane abruptly, bringing his meal to a close. "I must take up my journey by daylight."
And I,
added the Frenchman.
host, show us to our chambers, yeah.
Black shadows wavered on the walls as the two followed their silent host down a long, dark hall. The stocky, broad body of their guide seemed to grow and expand in the light of the small candle which he carried, throwing a long, grim shadow behind him. You think so, Gyro? Okay, let's bring it back then. At a certain door, the host halted. By all means, guys, sing out and tell me if I'm yelling too quietly or too softly, because I want you to be comfortable. And sadly, there's no real feedback to be able to tell. At a certain door, the host halted, indicating they were to sleep there. They entered. The host lit a candle with the one he carried, then lurched back the way he had come. In the chamber, the two men glanced at each other. The only furnishings of the room were a couple of bunks, a chair or two, and a heavy table. "Let us see if there be any way to make fast the door," said Kane.
I like not the looks of mine host. There are racks on the doors for a jam for a bar,
said Gaston.
but no bar.
"We might break up the table and use its pieces for a bar," mused Kane.
Mon Dieu, you are timorous, monsieur.
Kane scowled. I like not being murdered in my sleep.
My faith,
The Frenchman laughed.
we had chance met until I overtook you on the forest road an hour before sunset. We had never seen each other.
Yes, and still, I have seen you somewhere before, though I cannot now recall where. As for the other, I assume every man is an honest fellow until he shows up and shows me as a rogue. Moreover, I am a light sleeper and a slumberer with a pistol at hand, sir. The Frenchman laughed again.
I was wondering how monsieur could bring himself to sleep in the room with the stranger. All right, monsieur Englishman. Let us go forth and take a bath from one of the other rooms.
And so, taking the candle with them, they went into the corridor. Utter silence reigned, and the small candle twinkled redly and evilly in the thick darkness. Mine host hath neither guests nor servants, muttered Solomon Kane. A strange cavern this is. What is the name now? These German words come not easily to me. Rick, help me here. The cleft skull? A bloody name, in faith. They tried the rooms next to theirs, but no bar rewarded their search. At last they came to the last room at the end of the corridor, and they entered. It was furnished like the rest, except that the door was provided with a small barred opening, and fastened from the outside with a heavy bolt which was secured at one end of the door jamb. They raised the bolt and looked in. There should be an outer window here, but there's not. Look, said Kane. They looked. The floor was stained darkly. The walls in one bunk were hacked in places, great splinters having been torn away. Men have died in here, said Kane somberly. Is yonder not a bar fixed in the wall?
Aye, but 'tis made fast,
said the Frenchman, tugging at it.
A
section of the wall swung back, and Gaston gave a quick exclamation. The small secret room was revealed, and the two men bent over the grisly thing that lay upon its floor. Thank you, Dagmar. The skeleton of a man, said Gaston.
And behold how his bony leg is shackled to the floor, this skeleton. He was imprisoned here and died.
Nay, said Kane, the skull is cleft. Methinks mine host had a grim reason for the name of his hellish tavern. This man, like us, was no doubt a wanderer who fell into the fiend's hands.
Likely so,
said Gaston without interest. He was engaged in idly working the great iron ring from the skeleton's leg bones. Failing in this, he drew his sword, and with an exhibition of remarkable strength, Gaston cut the chain which joined the ring on the leg to a ring set deep in the log floor.
But why would he shackle a skeleton to the floor? Mon bleu, 'tis a waste of good chain. Now, monsieur,
he ironically addressed the white heap of bones,
I have freed you, yon skeleton, and you may go where you like.
Have done. Kane's voice was deep. No good will come of mocking the dead.
Ha! 'Tis the dead should defend themselves,
laughed Ramon.
Somehow I will slay the man who kills me, I shall. Whoever kills me, I shall slay him, though my corpse climb up 40 fathoms of ocean to do it.
Kane turned toward the outer door, closing the door of the secret room behind him. He liked not this talk, which smacked of demonry and witchcraft. He was in haste to face the host with a charge of guilt. As he turned, with his back to the Frenchman, Kane felt the touch of cold steel against his neck, and he knew that a pistol muzzle was now pressed close beneath the base of his brain.
Move not, monsieur.
The voice was low and silky.
Move not, or I will scatter your few brains over the room.
Solomon Kane, the Puritan, raged inwardly, stood with his hands in the air, while Lermont slipped his pistols and sword from their sheaths.
Now you can turn,
said Gaston, stepping back. Kane bent a grim eye on the dapper fellow, who stood bareheaded now, hat in one hand, the other hand leveling his long pistol. Gaston the butcher, said the Englishman somberly. Fool that I was to trust a Frenchman. You range far, murderer. I remember you now, with that cursed great hat off. I saw you in Calais, some years agone.
Aye, and now you will see me never again. Ha ha! Hey, what was that?
Like enough, returned the other. Rats exploring yon skeleton, said Kane, watching the bandit like a hawk waiting for a single light wavering from that black gun muzzle. The sound was the rattle of bones, said Kane.
Yes, like enough. Now, Monsieur Kane, I know you shall carry considerable of money on your person, eh? I had thought to wait until you slept and then slay you. But the opportunity has presented itself, and I took it. You trick easily, Monsieur Kane.
I had little thought that I should fear a man with whom I had broken bread, said Kane, a deep timbre of slow fury sounding in his voice. The bandit laughed cynically. His eyes narrowed as he began to back toward the outer door slowly. Kane's sinews tensed involuntarily. He gathered himself like a giant wolf about to launch himself in a death leap. But Gaston's hand was like a rock, and the pistol never trembled.
We will have no death plunges after the shot,
said Gaston.
Stand still, monsieur. I have seen men killed by dying men, and I wish to have distance enough between us to preclude that possibility in this instance. My faith, I will shoot, you will roar and charge, but you will die before you reach me with your bare hands. And mine host will have another skeleton in his secret niche. That is, if I do not kill him myself. The fool knows me not, nor I him. Moreover.
And now the Frenchman was in the doorway, sighting along the barrel. The candle which had been stuck in the niche on the wall shed a weird and flickering light which did not extend past the doorway. With the suddenness of death, from the darkness behind Gaston's back, a broad, vague form rose up, and a gleaming blade swept down. The Frenchman went to his knees like a butchered ox, his brain spilling from his cleft skull. Above him towered the figure of the host, a wild and terrible spectacle, still holding the hanger with which he had slain the bandit. Ho, ho! Back! Kane had leaped forward as Gaston fell, but the host thrust into his face a very long pistol which he held in his left hand. Back! Ha ha! He repeated in a tigerish roar, and Kane retreated from the menacing weapon in the insanity and those red eyes. The Englishman stood silent, his flesh crawling as he sensed a deeper and more hideous threat than the Frenchman had offered. There was something inhuman about this man, who now swayed to and fro like some great forest beast while his mirthless laugh boomed out again. Gaston the butcher! Ha ha! He kicked the corpse at his feet. Ho ho! My fine brigand will hunt no more. I had heard of this fool who roamed the Black Forest. He wished gold and he found death. And now your gold shall be mine, and more than gold, vengeance. I am no foe of yours, Solomon Kane spoke calmly. All men are my foes. Look, the marks on my wrist. See, the marks on my ankles. And deep in my back the kiss of the knout. And deep in my brain the wounds of the years of cold, silent cells where I laid as punishment for a crime I never committed. The voice broke in a hideous, grotesque sob. Kane made no answer. This man was not the first he had seen whose brain had shattered amid the horrors of the terrible continental prisons. Ha! Ha! But I escaped! And here I make war on all men! Bah! What was that? Did Kane see a flash of fear in those hideous eyes? My sorcerer is rattling his bones, whispered the host, then laughed wildly. Dying, he swore his very bones would weave a net of death for me. But I shackled his corpse to the floor, and now deep in the night I hear his bare skeleton clash and rattle as he seeks to be free, and I laugh, ho ho, how he yearns, that skeleton, to rise and stalk like an old King Death along these dark corridors while I sleep. Ha 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 ha, he yearns to slay me in my bed. Suddenly the insane eyes flashed hideously. You were in that secret room, you and this dead fool. Did he talk to you? Kane shuddered in spite of himself. Was it insanity? Or did he actually hear the faint rattle of bones? As if the skeleton had moved slightly. Kane shrugged his shoulders. Rats will even tug at the dusty bones. The host was laughing again. He sidled around Kane, keeping the Englishman always covered, and with his free hand opened the door. All was darkness within, so Kane could not even see a glimmer of the bones on the floor. All men are my foes, mumbled the host in the incoherent manner of the insane. Why should I spare any man who lifted a hand
to my aid when I lay for years in the vile dungeons of Coral Rouge, and for a deed never proven. Something happened to my brain then. I became as a wolf, a brother to these black forests, to which I fled when I escaped. They have feasted, my brothers, on all who lay in my tavern, all, except this one who now clashes his bones, this magician from Russia, lest he come stalking back to the black shadows when night is over the world, and slay me. For who may slay the dead? I stripped his bones and I shackled him. His sorcery was not powerful enough to save him from me. But all men know that a dead magician is more evil than a living one. Move not, Englishman. Your bones I shall leave in the secret room beside this one, too.
The maniac was standing partly in the doorway of the secret room now, his weapon still menacing Kane. Suddenly, he seemed to topple backward and vanished in the darkness. And at the same instant, a vagrant gust of wind swept down the outer corridor and slammed the door shut behind him. The candle on the wall flickered and went out. Kane's groping hand, sweeping over the floor, found a pistol, and he straightened, facing the door where the maniac had vanished. Kane stood in the utter darkness, his blood freezing, while a hideous, muffled screaming came from the secret room, intermingled with the dry, grisly rattle of fleshless bones. And then silence fell. Kane found flint and steel and lighted the candle, and then holding it in one hand and the pistol in the other, he opened that secret door. Great God, he muttered as cold sweat formed on his body. This thing is beyond all reason, yet with mine own eyes I see it. 2 vows have here been kept. For Gaston the butcher swore that even in death he would avenge his slaying. And his was the hand which set yon fleshless monster free, and he... The host of the cleft skull lay lifeless on the floor of the secret room, his bestial face set in lines of terrible fear, and deep in his broken neck were sunk the bare finger bones of the sorcerer's skeleton. Solomon Kane's Homecoming. In no place is his decaying frame of mind clearer than the poem Solomon Kane's Homecoming. Now, this piece about the Puritan adventurer was published a few months after Howard's death. It's a simple and haunting thing. After years of adventure, Solomon Kane returns home, wanting nothing more than to rest. But the restlessness gripping his mind and soul refused to leave him be, so that very same evening he leaves, journeying to parts unknown. His work is not done, even though the submerged, rational part of Kane's psyche wishes simply to kick back and relax. The white gulls wheeled above the cliffs. The air was slashed with foam. The long tides moaned along the strand when Solomon Kane came home. He walked in silence, strange and dazed, to the little Devon town. His gaze, like a ghost, came back to life, roamed up the streets and down. The people followed wonderingly to mark his spectral stare, and in the tavern silently they thronged about him there. He heard as a man hears in a dream the worn old rafters creak, and Solomon lifted his drinking jack and spoke as a ghost might speak. There sat Sir Richard Grenville once, in smoke and flame he passed, and we were 1 to 53, but we gave them blast for blast. From crimson dawn to crimson dawn we held the dawns at bay. The dead lay littered on our decks, our masts were shot away. We beat them back with broken blades till crimson ran the tide. Death thundered in the cannon smoke when Richard Grenville died. We should have blown her hull apart and sunk beneath the main. The people saw upon his wrist the scars of the racks of Spain. Where is Bess? Said Solomon Kane. Woe that I caused her tears.
In the quiet churchyard by the sea she has slept these 7 years.
The sea wind moaned at the window pane, and Solomon bowed his head. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and the fairest fade, he said. His eyes were mystical deep pools that drowned unearthly things. And Solomon lifted up his head and spoke of his wanderings. Mine eyes have looked on the sorcery in dark and naked lands, horror born of the jungle gloom and death of the pathless sands. And I have known a deathless queen in a city old as death, where towering pyramids of skulls her glory witnesseth. Her kiss was like an adder's fang, with the sweetness Lilith had, and the red-eyed vassals howled for blood in that city of the mad. And I have slain a vampire shape that drank a black king white, and I have roamed through grisly hills where dead men walked at night.
And I have seen heads fall like fruit in a slaver's barracoon, and I have seen winged demons fly all naked in the moon. My feet are weary of wandering, and age comes on apace. I fain would dwell in Devon now forever in my place.
The howling of the ocean pack came whistling down the gale, and Solomon Kane threw up his head like a hound that sniffs the trail. Adown the wind like a running pack the hounds of the ocean bayed, and Solomon Kane rose up again and girt his Spanish blade. In his strange cold eyes a vagrant gleam grew wayward and blind and bright, and Solomon put the people by and went into the night. A wild moon rode the wild white clouds, the waves in white crests flowed, when Solomon Kane went forth again, and no man knew his road. They glimpsed him etched against the moon, where clouds on hilltop thinned, and they heard an eerie echoed call that whistled down the wind. That's the last story written by Robert E. Howard of Solomon Kane, and all the things that he talks about in that poem refer to stories of Solomon Kane, where he has encountered vampires and things in Africa and sorcerers and deadly queens. And so there's a lot of good stories there if you're into that sort of thing. The Savage Tales of Solomon Kane.